So let's start at the beginning. It's 1619. The first 20 African slaves are sold to settlers in Virginia as indentured servants. Fast forward a couple years. It's 1789, and now we have the Constitution. Slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person, but only for representation. Now we have the Dred Scott decision in 1857. Mr. Scott, a slave, says that African American people are so far inferior that they have no rights which the white man has bound to respect. Long story short, the court declared the slaves were not citizens and therefore could not sue. Then, in 1861, the Civil War begins. 4 long years later, the Civil War ends. Lincoln is assassinated on April 15th, 1865, and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified. Now, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the great states. Soon comes the 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, which made African Americans full citizens of the United States, also prohibiting states from denying them from equal protection or due process of a law. 3 years later, 1870-ish, the 15th Amendment was enacted, which granted the right to vote will not be denied or abridged on account of race. But even though this was the law, white people did not want black people to vote. So they made a literacy test that had to be passed in order to be able to vote. The unfairness of this was that no white person had to take the test, and a lot of them could even pass themselves.
Water fountain. It said white on one and black on the other. I thought, this is crazy. Water's water.
Even though black people weren't slaves anymore, they still had less rights than a felon. That's kind of messed up. I'm not the only one to think this, though. People started to protest these inequalities in order to create a fair America. But in the same year, Plessy versus Ferguson took place. Long story short, Plessy, a white man my skin color but black my ancestry, sat in the whites-only section of the train announcing that it was really black. His argument was that the cars were in fact not equal and that separate but equal doctrine was not being upheld. Unfortunately, the court ruled that the cars were equal, but this was the start of more to come. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP, was founded. They ran voter registration drives and lobbied against discrimination in housing and employment. The NAACP also showed how federal courts could be used to attack segregation. Courts were the only place where black people could make strong arguments that would not be heard in a political or Congress conventions. Now, the NAACP has been trying to chip away at segregation, but they weren't going to challenge the Plessy separate but equal doctrine. Instead, they would focus on Miss Linda Brown. Linda was an 8-year-old attending an all-black school. A law in Kansas that permitted schools to maintain segregated schools was forcing Linda to take the bus to an all-black school, where she lived only 3 blocks from an all-white elementary school. NAACP Thurgood Marshall argued how segregated schools were unequal and lowered the self-esteem of black children. On May 17, 1954, the unanimous court decision stated, "Does segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprive the children of minority group equal education opportunities? We believe that it does. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate but educational facilities are inherently unequal." This left the courts with another problem of how to bring about this new decision. There were 2 possible solutions: give Plessy teeth or overturn Plessy altogether. The second option was chosen, which led to Brown v. Board of Education case. This also led to the Brown v. Board of Education 2. The decision was that local school boards would have to design a desegregation plan. These plans would proceed with all deliberate speed, which was very big.
It was awkward at first with integration, but people just did it.
How did you feel about it?
I think it was fine. I couldn't see why we wouldn't do it. It didn't make any sense to me where you'd see bathrooms and they'd say white or black, or when you go to the doctor's office and there was a black people's room for waiting and a white people's. It didn't make any sense.
For some places, like Little Rock, Arkansas, the transition was not as smooth. Their plan was to introduce 9 black high school students to the Little Rock High, but the students were met with mobs and threats. The local National Guards were told not to let them in, and President Eisenhower himself had to order the armed guards to accompany the 9 kids to class for their own safety.
Just watching it, I guess being shocked that people could be so angry and unwilling to try. I mean, I tell you the story about the gift wrap paper. That's truly how I've always felt about skin color. I mean, cultural difference, or that's something else, but nobody has a choice what color their skin are. It's whatever you're born with. What you have choices about are what's inside of you.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement. We learned about him first thing we learned about the civil rights movement in first grade. Martin Luther King was strongly believed in Gandhi's ideals and preached his methods. King had 4 basic steps to a nonviolent campaign, which were 1. Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices are alive, 2. Negotiation, 3. Self-purification, and 4. Direct action.
I have a real hard time with violence. You ever have a chance to see Gandhi, the movie? And the way he handled his life and the world and prejudices. He's my kind of guy. He felt like anything could be worked out. People didn't have to hurt each other in order to succeed. I think that's pretty cool.
One example of a nonviolent protest was the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black freshmen from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat down at the whites-only counter at Woolworth's. They ordered coffee and donuts politely, and as anticipated, were not served. They stayed at the counter until closing, then left. The next more people showed up the next day, and the day after that, even more people showed up. Soon, all over the town, sit-ins were happening with hundreds of black students and the occasional white supporter. Because of the boycott, while merchants were losing money and finally agreed to let African Americans eat at Woolworth's on July 25, 1960. This victory sent a shock through the South, triggering more sit-ins, causing more arrests. A group of Nashville students created rules of conduct when protesting that was adopted by protesters everywhere. Don't strike back or curse if abused. Show yourself courteous and friendly at all times. Report all serious incidents to your leader in a polite manner. Remember love and nonviolence. Protesters relied on the extreme reactions of the police and white people to show how injustices and to make people see, wow, this is a huge problem. Those students were only getting coffee. Why should they be beaten and arrested for nothing? With the help of Martin Luther King Jr. and groups like the NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the nonviolent movement blossomed.
What's your earliest memory of racial difference?
In a positive or negative way?
Either one.
Well, when I was really, really young, my dad was very sick, and mother and he would go to different hospitals all over the country. And this wonderful lady named Hattie Boone, who happens to be black, would take care of me. And I can remember getting on the bus and wanting to sit on the back of the bus because I thought that was the coolest place. And they wouldn't let me because of the segregation. They would tell Hattie to sit in the front of the bus with me because I was white. And I never did understand that. I mean, as a child especially, and Hattie was just such a wonderful person and friend. I couldn't understand it. I think that was the first time I ever noticed it. I probably was 2.5, 3 years old.
In 1961, freedom rides started in Washington, D.C. The goal was to test whether or not court orders banning segregation in interstate travel would hold up when traveling to the South. James Farmer, the director of CORE, announced, "Our intention was to provoke the Southern authorities into arresting us and thereby prod the Justice Department into enforcing the law of the land." So on May 4th, 7 blacks and 6 whites split into 2 groups. and started their bus ride to Alabama and Mississippi. At first it was going relatively well, and they were only getting limited harassment. But when one of the buses entered Anniston, Alabama, an angry mob attacked the bus, smashing windows and slashing tires. 6 miles out of the town, when the tires went flat, a firebomb was thrown into the bus, forcing the passengers to evacuate. The freedom fighters were beat with blackjacks, iron bats, and clubs, and the bus burst into flame. A similar event occurred in the second bus in Anniston, leaving one freedom fighter close to death and permanently brain damaged. Although police and FBI were alerted to the situation, nothing was done to help. Many more freedom rides occurred throughout the year, jailing hundreds of people on charges of inflaming the public opinion. Freedom fighters stuck to the policy of jail, no bail, suffering through beatings and mistreatments. Finally, in 1962, the Supreme Court rules that segregation is unconstitutional in all transportation facilities.
The most memorable thing, I guess, was Martin Luther King being shot.
Despite the death of two major civil rights leaders, the civil rights movement had a lasting impact on America that changed the lives of many and made America a better place for anyone living here.
As I used to tell my students in school, the color of your skin is just a gift wrap. It has nothing to do with what's inside a person.